So, hi to anybody that's currently watching this. This is quite exciting. This is a new phenomenon for me. I'm doing a talk which is being streamed. And the talk is currently, it's aimed at young Buddhists within Triratna, but hopefully there'll be something of interest for others as well in this talk. So I'm here in New York, which is very exciting. I'm in New York City and I'm staying with some friends. So at some point, we might even hear some doors opening and closing as they come back from their brunch. Chandra Dasa of the Buddhist Centre Online asked me if I would do this as part of participating in the BAM month, the Buddhist Action Month. And as part of that, today is a day for Triratna young Buddhists around the world. So I have no idea who's watching, if anybody's watching. According to a little thing at the bottom here, there are 3 viewers. I'm pretty sure Chandra Das is one of those viewers. So it looks like there might be 2 others somewhere in the world. So I'm just going to talk, and then at some point I might stop and see if anybody has any questions. It's a slightly odd medium because I can't actually see what kind of responses I'm getting, and I might even just be talking to the void. But anyway, I'm going to just start. So the topic I was asked to talk on was, I've got some notes somewhere. Yeah, the topic I was asked to talk on was radical then and radical now. So I've got some notes that I jotted down just to see. But before I actually start in on a more formal talk, I thought I'd just introduce myself. So I'm Parami. I've been ordained for 35 years this year. So I hope you can see by looking at me and listening to that fact that I was extremely young when I got ordained. So I was a young person once as well. And I got involved in Buddhism and in what was then the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, now Triratna Buddhist Community, in 1977. So I was 25 when I got involved. And I'd come from quite a political background, so there were different strands to that. I'd been involved in left-wing politics. I'd been involved in the women's movement. I'd been involved to some extent with LGBT, which at that point was known more as lesbian and gay politics. So I had really been looking for some way to change the world. That was the kind of, that was my agenda, really. I was looking for a way to work against the poverty that I could see around me, the injustices that I could see around me, the ideas of that it was okay that some people in the world, a very few people in the world, owned and had recourse to a vast number of the world's resources, while a vast number of people on the planet didn't have access so easily to those resources. So my kind of main political involvement was on the left, was around the kind of communist background, really, left-wing communist. But really what happened was I'd got quite disillusioned. I'd come to the realisation that, which I can articulate now, although I couldn't really have articulated it so clearly in 1977, but I'd realised that in some ways I was part of the problem rather than part of a solution. And that was because my desire to change the world came with a lot of anger. It came with a lot of, kind of rage even. And from that point of view, I did not come at it from a very creative sort of point of view. I also realised that a number of the people who I was involved with politically, although the ideas and the theory were excellent and, in many ways was a very stimulating, exciting, convincing analysis of the world's problems, the solutions weren't so clear or so obvious or so easy to see. And many of the people, myself included, who were very idealistic and very keen to try and change the world, were actually acting out of what I would now, as a Buddhist, call greed, hatred, and ignorance. So we weren't coming from a place of wisdom and a place of calm and a place of being centered within ourselves. So I'd become very disillusioned. Other things were happening in my own personal life, which meant that really I was not in a very good state. I've often said this in talks, that I wanted to change the world, but my mental state was such that I couldn't even change my library books on time. I was constantly having to pay fines for being late with my library books, which might sound really silly, but I worked in a public library, so it seemed quite amazing that I couldn't even pick up my library books in the morning and take them back on time. And that was a little bit, for me, that was a little bit paradigmatic of the fact that I had great ideas, but I actually couldn't really put them into practice because I wasn't in a very good mental state. In fact, in retrospect, I was probably close to having a breakdown. So in that space, I came across the Glasgow Buddhist Centre. And in the Glasgow, that night, the night that I saw a poster basically, and I'd been sitting thinking, I must change my life, I must change my life. And then I saw a poster which said, change your life. So that seemed like a bit of an omen, or a bit of a good idea. So I went along to the class that had been advertised in this poster. And what it was advertising was a talk given by Sangharakshita, our founder, who we often refer to as Bhante. So if I refer to him as Bhante, I'm talking about Sangharakshita, who founded the movement. So this was October 1977. I went along to hear a talk. I'd come to the realization myself that you couldn't change the world without changing people, and that meant changing me. So I was looking for some way to change myself. And I stumbled into the Glasgow Buddhist Centre, and I listened to a tape lecture of a talk which Sangharakshita had given the year before. And this talk was part of a series of talks which were known as Buddhism for Today and Tomorrow. And the subtitle was something like a radical alternative, or the word radical was then in the title anyway. So I thought this looks quite interesting. So I went along to the Glasgow Buddhist Centre. And this talk that I listened to, which was the second in the series of 4, was in which Sangharakshita was talking about the fact that you cannot change the world without changing yourself. But he made the point very strongly that the reason one changed oneself was to then participate in the creation of a better world. So he talked in that series of talks, and in many other places at that time in the 70s, he talked about the creation of a new society. So a new society was quite a popular idea in the 80s, the 70s and 80s, maybe going further back, the 60s and 70s. And it was what I was looking for, really. I was looking for a radical way to live in the world. I was completely dissatisfied with the options that were open and offered to me. And I really wanted to find some way of living more radically, both in a personal sense, but also in sense of offering something more radical to the world. So that I was very convinced by this talk and by the others in the series. So I got involved and kind of signed up very quickly for that. So I'm just seeing that a couple of other people have come in, and in fact, at least one of them, I can actually see her. So that's the area in Mexico. So I'm not quite sure who else is listening, but there are other viewers, so hello to all of you. So I've kind of been talking a little bit about my own becoming involved in the movement and the fact that I was looking for a radical option. I was looking for a way to radically change myself and also radically change the world. So this is a rather disconcerting medium to give a talk on, so I'm going to just carry on. It's just a little bit disconcerting because people are coming in and going out. So being a bit more used to giving talks in a Buddhist centre where I can see who I'm talking to or whatever. giving talks to people that I can see. It's slightly disconcerting to be talking to myself on a screen. Anyway, so I got very involved in the movement, and the reason why this movement convinced me is something that I wanted to involve myself in was because Sangharakshita offered, or Buddhism offered through Sangharakshita, on the one hand, a method to develop oneself, so ways of actually working with the anger that I felt and the despair that I felt. And on the other hand, it offered the creation of a new society. There was the whole aspect of hoping that what one did would have an effect in the world. So I believe that Buddhism still has much that's radical to offer. So the talk today is titled Radical Then and Radical Now. So when I became involved in the movement, we were mainly young. So this is predominantly a talk for young Buddhists, which I think is, in some places is under 35 and in some places is under 40. Well, when I got involved, as I think I said, I was 25. And so most of us who were getting involved at that point were actually in our 20s. We were relatively footloose and fancy free. We were able to live together. We were able to, some of us. I'm just going to have a little technological moment here. Aurea, I think it might be best if you turn your camera off.
Aquí está bien.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's probably a bit better because you're kind of swinging in and out a bit. So I'll just look at your nice photograph. Anyway, where was I? So there I was in my 20s, getting involved in Buddhism, meeting a lot of other people who were also in their 20s and who also wanted to change themselves and change the world. So I lived in a women's community from very early on, and I just threw myself into learning more about the Buddha, more about Buddhism, and more about what I personally could do. So I'm going to give a little bit more, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Buddha as a radical figure, historically. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our movement, Triratna. Particularly, I want to talk a little bit about India, where we have a number of order members in a big community. And then I want to just end the talk by bringing it up to date and saying a little bit about maybe what we can do now. So interesting that the Buddha lived in a very, very different world from us. The Buddha lived in an agrarian society, tribal. He lived in a society where, of course, he could see greed, hatred, and delusion as he described it. And he could see that there was a need to tackle greed, hatred, and delusion. He could see that there was a sense of a need, there was a need for an ethics. There was a need, and he challenged common mores in his society. Two things in particular that he challenged, which were quite radical at the time. So he challenged gender and he challenged caste, perhaps even more radically. So in terms of the challenging of gender, although there's all sorts of stories around the formation of the nuns' Sangha, the women's part of the Sangha, the fact of the matter was that the Buddha did agree that women as well as men could gain enlightenment, and he therefore agreed to them joining the monastic community. He had lay women followers right from the very beginning. He had women followers who were very much part of the community. He had lay women followers who generously gave alms to him. They gave him places where he could teach. He had a very strong personal relationship with many of his personal female disciples. They were very much part of the Sangha. Now, this might sound fairly commonplace in the 21st century, but even still in some parts of the world, that would be radical. And certainly in India, 2,500 years ago, that was extremely radical. There were all sorts of conditions around the women being able to practice, and it's hard to know where those conditions came from. They must have had at least some aspect of the social conditions that they lived in. The nuns weren't allowed, for example, to go alone into the forest. But that probably made sense because it probably wasn't terribly safe for a woman on her own to be practicing in that way. So the nuns' community formed quite early. So there was a monastic female Sangha very early on in the Buddha's day, and there was a lay female Sangha very early. So women were part of the Sangha, and that was quite a radical thing. The other thing that was quite radical was that the Buddha challenged caste. He didn't accept the current caste system that was in play then, and indeed is still in play in many parts of India. But he challenged that. And for example, there's a rather lovely story where probably his cousin, the Buddha's cousin, and some others, some young men, Brahminical young men, wanted to join the Buddha's Sangha. And they came along with their servant. And they asked to join the Sangha. And because, well, for all sorts of reasons, there was a hierarchy and people had to look up to their seniors within the Sangha. And the Buddha ordained the servant before he ordained the Brahminical chaps, the youth, which meant that from the moment they entered the Sangha, those Brahminical as they had been, they lost their caste. The Buddhist Sangha was a casteless Sangha. And so they immediately lost their caste, and immediately they had to start to look up to their previous servant. Well, I quite like that story. And I think it illustrates quite well the fact that the Buddha really did cut through caste. The Buddha philosophically also cut through caste because he taught conditioned co-production. And he taught that although our current actions will have consequences and our current actions will determine to some extent future consequences, he made it very clear that this was not a linear thing, and that caste, the fact that someone was born in a lower caste, was not necessarily a reflection of where they'd come from, as it were. But even more importantly, he made the point that it did not determine where they could go. It did not determine the progress that they could make. So that again was really quite radical in the Buddha's day. Now, sometimes modernly, in the modern world, people see, particularly perhaps in the Western world, but anyway, currently people often see Buddhism as a religion of quietism, as a religion of contemplation, a contemplative religion. And of course, the whole stream of meditation, of changing one's mind, of working with one's own mental states, of radically changing oneself as a human being is central to the Buddhist teaching and central to practice as a Buddhist. But it doesn't end there. The Buddha also did give social teachings. He didn't just teach meditation under a tree in the forest. He engaged in the current issues. He engaged in the issues of the day. And I thought at this point I'd quite like to switch into reading you from a sutra. So from the Pali Canon, from a very early sutra, a sutra called, let me just check if I can find the name, the Mahanidana Sutta. So the Nidana means chain, and the idea of a chain of actions and consequences is well known in Buddhism. And it's usually expressed in a personal sense. It's usually expressed in terms of my own lifetime. And it's sometimes expressed in the evolution of consciousness from past to present to future. And it's seen as a chain of conditionality, so that in dependence upon one particular factor in the chain arises the next factor in that chain. And that's seen in the life of the individual. So from our ignorance, we're told sanskaras arise, or volition, karmic action arises. This causes consciousness. This causes name and form. This goes on. I won't go through the whole chain because it's easy enough for people to find. There's many, many references to it. But it's given in terms of the important point here that I want to make is there's a point where contact, the being, comes into contact. And that contact And the sensations that arise from that give rise to desire, give rise to Trishna. And that desire then gives rise to attachment. So in the personal sense, craving gives rise to a desire to hold and to fix and to make mine. So as we know, we try to create our own identity by pulling towards ourselves what will shore up that identity. And we try to protect that identity by pushing away everything that might threaten that identity. So this chain, this nidana, is a particular way, a particular model for understanding that process. However, the Buddha also in this sutra taught that this link, these links, this chain, could be seen in a social sense. So he says in this particular sutra, he says, craving is dependent upon feeling. Seeking is dependent upon craving. So because we crave, we seek. And then he says, in dependence upon this seeking arises acquisition. In dependence upon this acquisition arises ascertainment, the making of mind, the holding to. In dependence upon this arises desire and passion. In dependence upon this arises possessiveness. And in dependence upon possessiveness arises stinginess. I have no idea what the Pali is that is being here described as stinginess. In dependence upon this stinginess, or this desire, this meanness, arises defensiveness. Because what is mine, I will defend. And because of this defensiveness, says the Buddha, evil, unskillful phenomena come into play. The taking up of sticks and knives come into play. Conflicts, quarrels and disputes. Accusations, divisive speech and lies become the norm of the day. So I think this is really very interesting that the Buddha was saying the independence upon our desire, this does not only have an effect in our personal lives. And this again is quite radical. The Buddha is saying that possessiveness, that desire to own, to acquire, to defend, to hold, all of these things, in the Mahanidana Sutta, all of these things we're told lead to nothing but social ill and evil and downright misery. So I see that the link to this discourse has just been posted, and hopefully people can see that and can have a look at that for themselves later. There's another sutra that the Buddha, in which the Buddha talks about the social evils of desire and possession. And well, there's another couple actually that I've got here. One of them is the Agana Suta, which is sometimes known as the Rice Sutta. And the story in this sutta is that there's, to begin with, everybody just had enough rice. They harvested it, they cooked it, they ate it. There you go. Everybody was well enough fed. There was enough to go around. But then some people realised that they could hoard their rice. And some unscrupulous people started to steal rice. And they started to hoard their rice, and they created the conditions where other people could not grow their rice anymore. So you suddenly had inequity. You suddenly had a social setting where some people had the rice, others did not have the rice. The people who had the rice could then sell it, or they could in some way negotiate the possibility of the other people having rice. Does this sound familiar? Does this actually sound like a situation that we might recognise in the world today, 2,500 years later, where not only rice is stolen and sold in this way, but even the water supply on our planet is no longer free for many people. Anyway, so we're told in this that what happens is that with this scarcity of people suddenly being without rice, what happens then is censure, lying, and punishment starts to arise. So as soon as you have this system where some have and some have not, all sorts of social ills will follow. So the Buddha does analyze social ill. He does analyze social situations. And he does this in the very early sutras. And he analyzes it back to the three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion. So the Buddha talks much and in many places about these three poisons, about greed or passion. Passion, not in the sense of feeling passionate about life, but in the sense of passion, of craving, of the thirst to possess and to hold and to make mine. And hatred. And of course, these are very, very linked, because many times hatred arises because I do not get what I want, or I have got what I want, but somebody else might try and take it away from me. So hatred arises. And all of this comes from a basic delusion, from basic ignorance. So this ignorance is the ignorance of truly believing that we are separate from each other. And I will come back to that. But before I do talk about that and the illusion of separateness, which is perhaps one of the Buddha's most radical teachings, that this is indeed a truly false way of being in this world. And yet it's the delusion through which we see the world again and again and again. Now we'll come back to that, but for now I want to just look a little bit more at the modern world, the world that we're currently living in. So I got involved, as I said, in our movement. I came along, I met Buddhism. I had actually come across Buddhism before. Maybe I'll just have a little segue at this moment. And because when I was setting up the talk Chandradas, I did say I could make it anecdotal. I could tell some stories from my own experience. So when I did actually come across Buddhism quite early, quite a bit before 1977, I had read some books about Buddhism. I'd also gone to a meditation class, which was, I believe, a Zen meditation class. I can't even quite remember, but somebody told me about it. So I went to this class in Glasgow. I walked into this really beautiful space. Nobody spoke. Everybody nodded at each other and bowed at each other. I had no idea what I was doing. We were given a cushion to sit on. We looked at a blank white wall. So, of course, everybody was sitting there with their eyes closed. I was sitting there kind of like this, trying to see what on earth was going on, because I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. A bell was rung. We went into silence. And maybe half an hour later, another bell was rung. Everybody got up, they bowed, and they left. And I had absolutely no idea. So I came to the conclusion that meditation was really not for me. I had also gone to another centre, which was the Rajneesh Centre at the time, I believe Osho, they're now known as. And what we did there was a dancing meditation, which was much better fun. And quite a lot of shaking around. And then afterwards we sat still for 10 minutes, which was quite amazing actually, because after having shaken around and moved around quite a lot, I did enter quite a deep sense of concentration. But I had no idea really what to do with that or what it meant or anything. And then what seemed to happen was that everybody paired up and kind of got off with each other. It seemed to be a place where people came when they were looking for a new partner, a new sexual partner, which I was really not looking for at that point. So I thought, okay, that wasn't really for me either. So when I came to the Triratna, the FWBO, I was a little bit unsure about whether I was that interested really in Buddhism or that interested really. I certainly wasn't interested in meditation. And it was only after a couple of weeks I was persuaded that really if I wanted to radically change, I had to meditate. So that persuaded me to go to the meditation class. And and I got instructions and learned how to do both a practice of awareness through the Anapanasati, the mindfulness of breathing, and a practice of loving kindness. I learned both those practices, and they have stood me in very good stead for all those years, because they're radical. I better not diverge too much, but the metta bhavana practice, the practice of the development of loving kindness, is in itself a radical practice. I think if we come to Buddhism and we learn the metta bhavana, and really, really, I don't mean just learn the technique, but really learn to open our hearts and our minds to other beings, to come to them with openness and care and support and solidarity, that in itself would make a radical effect, would have a radical effect on the world. Anyway, I have completely lost track of what I was saying. But no worries. And because there's nobody sitting in front of me that I can see waving at me or anything, I have no idea whether that diversion has been useful or not. Quite soon after I got involved in the movement, I learned that we had some order members who were just moving to live in India. So I was quite interested in that. And by this time, it was maybe 2 years after I'd got involved, I was living in London, and there was a send-off for a couple of order members who were going to live in India. And so I was quite interested in that and started to read around a little bit about Buddhism in India, particularly through a figure called Dr. Ambedkar. Now, Dr. Ambedkar, I think, really picked up on the fact that the Buddha analysed social ills as well as personal ills. So I just want to say a little bit about Dr. Ambedkar. So Dr. Ambedkar was a figure he grew up in the untouchable caste, the Dalit caste. He was fortunate in that he got an education. Now, there's a long story involved in this, and it can be found. There's all sorts of places where this story can be found. Dr. Ambedkar's life and wonderful, amazing contribution to Indian society can be found. Anyway, he became the first law minister of India, which is extraordinary, and he was engaged in the drawing up of the Constitution of India after independence. But the interesting thing was that he had been thinking very, very deeply about caste issues. Of course, he'd been thinking about them because of his own personal experience, but he had managed in many ways to overcome some of that. But he looked around and he could see that millions of his fellow countrymen and women could not overcome the problems that they were living as a direct consequence of the caste system. And he also saw, and this was quite extraordinary, but he saw that caste, this is a quote from him, he said, "Caste is a notion, caste is a state of mind." And this was important because laws were changing, and there were laws that were meant to alleviate the suffering of that Dalit caste, that, as they were then known, untouchable caste. But although one changes the law, unless one's mindset changes, then people will still act according to their mindset. And so the whole mindset of the caste is still, of course, very alive. He could see that that notion of caste was integrally embedded in a particular mindset. And he also understood that what the mind created, the mind could undo. And this is very much the Buddha's teaching. So in 1936, Dr. Ambedkar vowed that he would not die a Hindu, that he would leave the Hindu religion and seek for another religion which would function not only for him on his own, but for his people, would function for everybody, would be a universal religion. And he had very definite criteria for the search that he wanted to use. He knew that a new religion, new for him, needed to enshrine certain principles, and those principles were liberty, freedom, equality, and fraternity or solidarity, brotherhood, sisterhood. He needed something that would utterly reject the caste system. However, partly because of his own education and background, it needed to be a religion which was not based on a blind superstitious belief, but it must be compatible with reason and with science. And it must not enshrine beliefs that controlled human fate. So this was quite radical because, of course, the whole caste system is based on a belief of a predetermined fate. And very, very importantly for him, it must not be a religion that justified poverty in any sense whatsoever. So he'd long been drawn to the Buddha and the Buddha's teachings, both because it had such spiritual power, and he could see and feel and recognize the spiritual power of the Buddha. But also he realized it had an emphasis on social morality. So he sincerely explored all the world's religions, all the major religions. He also looked very closely at Marxism, which of course interested me coming from a kind of commie background, a communist background, and he rejected that for various reasons. He wanted a religion and not a secular analytical system. So he chose to convert to Buddhism. So in 1956, he concluded that Buddhism was the best possible religion, not only for him, not even only for his people, but for the whole of humanity. It was the most radical choice for the whole of humanity. So in October 1956, he went for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And he then converted thousands of his own followers. And you could say that at that moment in India, the Dharma revolution had begun, or had revitalized that Dharma revolution. So Dr. Ambedkar believed that society's change would only come from a change in mental attitude and a change of outlook on the part of real live people who changed their own mind and then created the external conditions where other people's minds could also be changed, in the sense that their heart could open to the truth and the reality of their interconnectedness with others. And he considered that it was true for all people that a transformed society would come from the transformation of mind. That would be the only way to end up with a society based on love, mutuality, care, compassion, kindness. And he used the Buddha's teaching of the Four Noble Truths to illustrate this. So very basic, one of the Buddha's first teachings, the Four Noble Truths. Buddha taught that suffering exists, that there is a cause for that suffering, there is an end that is possible to that suffering, and there is a pathway that leads to the end of suffering. And he analysed that not only in terms of one's personal suffering, but in terms of society's suffering. So he said the suffering of the world has a cause, and that cause is greed. It's greed, hatred, and delusion. That suffering has a cause which is not only personal, but also has its roots in this. It's systemic. It's in society. And he saw that clinging to oneself, whether that self is the individual unit, or it's one's nation state, or it's one's group, or it's whatever one identifies with and therefore feels the need to protect and defend, that on that basis of that clinging, suffering will arise. So he taught that not only does individual suffering, but world suffering, not only suffering in a small pocket of the world, he taught he could see that suffering every day of his life from birth to death. He could see that suffering every single day in his own life and in the life of the people all around him. But he knew, he had the vision to know that suffering manifests in so many different ways throughout the world. That in every part of the world, where there is clinging in a belief in the separate nature of the self and in the separate nature of mine against theirs, that suffering existed. And it took many, many different forms. But that all of those forms could be challenged and could be moved in. It could be moved on. So this was in the 1950s. So is this still relevant to us as young Buddhists and not so young Buddhists living in the modern world? Well, yes, I do believe it is. I believe that the suffering that's around us in the world today comes from exactly that same root. And it's bigger than ever. And I think sometimes what happens is we feel very, very overwhelmed and very small in the face of global suffering. So this is Buddhist Action Month. And one of the things about Buddhist Action Month, I think it's quite important, is that we look not only at the big and global picture, but we look at the small individual steps that each and every one of us can take so that we can live more radically now in this world. So let me go back to what I said about the Buddha's understanding and teaching and that basic principle that there is no separate self. The Buddha taught that our problems come from that belief. He taught the teaching of dependent origination. So what that teaching says is that every phenomenon, all phenomena in the conditioned world, arise in dependence upon conditions, and that with the cessation of those conditions, that phenomenon will change, will cease to be in the form that it currently exists. So that teaching on a philosophical level is radical and really quite challenging to our view of ourselves. It teaches that we are not separate entities that have somehow come into existence, that have somehow just become, but that we ourselves have arisen in dependence upon all the conditions that make us up, the physical, the mental, the emotional. All of those conditions, our family conditioning, all those factors that are part of who we are. And because all of those factors arise in dependence upon conditions, as we change those conditions, we change the outcome. And that is wonderfully liberating. And it's not just the individual that arises in dependence upon conditions, but all phenomena, everything in the conditioned world is, we are taught, not separate. So the Buddha taught that all things were impermanent, that nothing lasts forever, that everything arises, its moment comes, it peaks, it passes, it falls. And that's fairly easy to see and understand. We can look around us and we can see the changes in seasons, we can see the changes in we can see the changes in ourselves. Our hair goes from black, in my case, to salt and pepper, to grey, to white. Our hair falls out. We change radically in every moment. Everything in me currently is only 7 years old because everything in me, even at the cellular level, has changed and changes. DNA apparently changes in the sense that every cell has changed every 7 years. I'm not a scientist, but I believe that to be the case. And what that's saying is that change is inherent in the human condition, change is inherent in everything. And that is our liberation as well as our trial. Because our suffering often comes not from the fact of change, but from the fact that we resist that change so drastically that we try to create conditions to cling to what is currently pleasant and to push away what is currently unpleasant. And that in that clinging and in that aversion, we therefore create the conditions for our current and our future suffering. But that's happening all the time in a myriad of ways, in a multi-layer of ways. So I am one condition, but so many conditions are there and happening in the world and arising and passing and arising and passing. And the Buddha said that what was really radical and what the Buddha said was not only that all phenomenon arise in dependence upon conditions and therefore are impermanent. He said because they arise in dependence upon conditions, they have no independent origination, they have no independent state. There is nothing in me that is independent from all the other conditions and phenomena that make up what is currently sitting in a room in New York, talking to people who knows where in the world. That everything in this is dependent upon conditions and is currently rising. And in that possibility for change is where we can radically alter and radically affect. We can really truly understand that, because that teaching of conditionality is not just philosophical, but it has an emotional counterpart. To the extent that we truly understand and truly break through that sense of a separate self and begin to live more and more from that space of interdependence, that space of recognizing that you, whoever you are out there listening, whoever might listen to this in the future, the people that we are connected with, all of us and all of those phenomena are deeply interconnected, then what arises in my heart as I understand that is a true and real and deep love and a compassion. A loving compassion. It's the only response possible. There's a text called the Bodhicharyavatara, written by a Buddhist poet called Shantideva, a philosopher and poet. And in this he says something which I think is really, really an interesting thing to reflect upon. He says, virtue is perpetually weak and feeble. The power of vice is great and extremely dreadful. If there were no spirit of perfect awakening, what virtue could possibly overcome this? So what he's saying in this is the power of good in the world, if we think in those terms, the power of good in the world can be very weak. And particularly if I think that I need somehow to be the force for good in the world, me, then that's weak. It's debil. It's debilitating. It's small. It's it's weak. It's feeble. It has no bite to it, or very little bite to it. And meanwhile, the world around me is constantly showing me the power of greed and hatred and delusion. And it doesn't only come, that power of greed, hatred and delusion is not only in individuals, it's institutionalized in our society. David Loy, who is a writer, an author, a Buddhist, a Zen practitioner, in one of his books, I can't remember where, he talks about the ego, which we're all terribly familiar with, and he talks about the WEGO, W-E-G-O. So he talks about the fact that that ego is bound so much with other egos, in the even up to the national and the international sort of level, and the power of those WEGOs is so strong. Whether that's a nation state, a corporation, the forces of evil, as it were, can seem very, very strong indeed. So Shantideva is telling us that the only way to really overcome that is through a perfect awakening, through a perfect awakening in the Buddhist path. And that perfect awakening is an awakening to that knowledge and that realization, indeed that experience. It's an experience of awakening to not being separate, to not needing to defend, to not needing to have aversion, to breaking through that separate sense of self and other. And that is the radical thing that we can offer. But what can we do about it? Well, first, I think every single one of us needs to work on ourselves. We need to work on our own unwillingness, on our own inability to, as it were, live truly from that free space of recognizing that we are not separate, that space of recognizing that we are completely interconnected. Because if we realize that, the implications are tremendous. The implications are tremendous in the sense that what arises will be a compassion for the world. But also we recognize that every single action, every single thing that I do just ripples outwards into the world. And there are all sorts of things that means for us in the world today. We can, all of us, look not only at our own inner world and inner practice, but how do we impact on the outer world? How can we live more simply? So I know, for example, in this Buddhist Action Month, many Triratna centres have chosen this time to focus on the whole topic of climate change. I've just come back from here in New York, in Upper New York, in the state of New York. We were, some of us from Triratna, took part in a conference of Western international Buddhist teachers. And yesterday, the day before yesterday, the last full day, the programme, the morning of the programme, was looking at how we impact and change, how we can change the world. And the first part of that morning was a panel on climate change. And I was reminded, listening to that, of something that I know and is not new to me, but it's easy to forget it, which is just what a massive and huge problem climate change really is. You know, we're talking about radically changing the world. We're talking about how to be radical and how to really face the world's problems. And this is such a huge problem at the moment. It is probably the big problem that we need to tackle. To the extent that we don't, according to the science that that was shared with us the other day, and I have no reason to disbelieve that science. And yeah, there's much evidence of this. There's still skepticism, but there's much evidence which says that really we are past or very close to the tipping point. We really need to act now. We really need to look at our carbon footprint. We need to look at our consumption. We need to look at how we walk across the world. The Buddha, we're told, left no trails behind him. And that's meaning in a karmic sense. He had got to the point where karma was burned out and where none of his actions created future problems for the world. What a beautiful thing to aspire to. We could really look at the trails that we leave behind us. I think that's a very good, very kind of appropriate way to think of how we step upon this planet. Can we leave as little trail behind us as possible? So there are all sorts of actions that we can take on a personal level. And I'm not going to go into all of them here and now, because there's eco-Dharma, there's lots of kind of websites that show ways of working in that. What I'd like to do, because I've now been talking for about 50 minutes, and I think it might be good to quite soon stop the monologue and perhaps see if there are any questions that people might want to send in. I'd like to finish by just telling you about a talk which I heard given by Sangharakshita. The talk was given in 1976, I believe, and I heard it maybe 1979 or 78. And the talk was called Evolution or Extinction, a Buddhist Response to Current World Issues. So this talk is available in free Buddhist audio, of course, and might even be it is certainly available in free Buddhist audio. And in that talk, Sangharakshita Bhante outlines a whole load of problems which are current to the world in 1976. I've actually got somewhere. Oh, never mind. I don't need quotes from it. So in that, he talks about poverty. He talks about the ecological crisis. He talks about war, the need for peace within oneself as much as peace outside oneself. And he goes through a whole series of that. He starts off by saying he's been asked as a Buddhist to talk about these things, and that often Buddhists are asked to comment on current world problems. And he feels that it's incumbent upon him. I think he even, I'm quoting here from memory, but he says something like, as a human being, let alone as a Buddhist, it is incumbent upon us to act and to make the world a better place. He says it's incumbent upon us to open our eyes to the world's problems, that Buddhism is not a religion that allows us to close our eyes. Although we close our eyes to allow ourselves to get more of a sense of that inner centeredness and that inner peace. That is not the end of the story, as I said at the very beginning of this talk. And in this talk, Evolutionary Extinction, Sangharakshita says, look, these really are the only two choices that we have ahead of us. He says, carry on the way we're going, and the world it'll come to extinction. So he was very much saying what climate change scientists were also saying, beginning to say in the 70s, but are now not saying. They're shouting, there's a clamour, it's everywhere. And he says we're heading for extinction. Now, whether that extinction comes from global warming and climate change, or whether it comes from people dying because they're living in abject poverty when the world has more resources than is necessary to hold, whether it comes from overpopulation, whatever the reasons are, Bhante says, he doesn't mention those things, that's me. He says we're heading for extinction. He says the only way forward is to evolve. We need to become a new species. We need to evolve into something new. And somebody mentioned in one of the talks that I heard a couple of days ago, the idea of a new species of humanity being known as humanus, homo universalis. In other words, recognizing the universal interconnectedness of all of us. And in this talk, Sangharakshita says we need to recognize that we are as one. He recognizes in this the need to create a new species, to create a shift in consciousness. And he offers 4 things that he thinks we can do. And I'll give you a very brief. I see that the reference has just popped up to that talk, Evolutionary Extinction, Current World Problems. According to this, 1971. My memory was that it was given in 1976, but there you go. I was wrong. Anyway, in this talk, he offers us at the end 4 things that we can do. So I've just been sent a question, which I will come back to. Hello, Rijapata. But before I do come to that, I will just talk about these 4 things which Sangharakshita offers us. He says, first of all, he says it's crucially important to find a method of personal development. And this is what I had realised when I stumbled upon Buddhism, and I talked about that at the beginning of this talk. I'd realised that without changing me, myself and I, without changing my own mental state and my own responses to the world, that I could not change anything in the world. So a method of personal development. And Sangharakshita talks about this as becoming more individual, becoming more separate from group values, and becoming more able to really take our place in the world and living in accordance with our Buddhist values. And then he says, secondly, find a community which will support those values, a community that will support your desire to evolve, your desire to be less driven by your conditioned nature and more able to creatively respond to what comes along. And then the third thing, and these last 2 I think are really interesting, and they speak a little bit to a question that's just popped up. Thirdly, he says, withdraw from all the institutions that work against your values. And then he says, if you cannot withdraw from those things, then influence them. So I think they're great. So find a method of personal development, find a community that will support your personal development and values, withdraw from the anti-individual forces that are there in society, and where you cannot withdraw, influence. So they're the 4 things that Sangharakshita offers, and I offer them now as a way of maybe looking at how we can radically affect the world today. So just while I was talking there, questions popped up, and it's from Rijapata, and it says, I wonder if you could talk a bit about some of the best ways for Buddhists to have a larger voice in the public discussion of important issues. So I think I can click a button and answer that by writing it, but I'll just answer it speaking to you. I think that's a really, really important question, and thank you for that, Rijapata. It's really important to bring that into the dialogue. And I think what Bante's saying in those two things of withdrawing our support and influencing are kind of like the background to what you're asking. How we'll actually do that, I think, will depend an awful lot on where we live in and how we live in and the kind of situations that we find ourselves in. In terms of withdrawing, I think we can really make choices about our actions and how they impact. So, for example, how we purchase. You know, it's something that's that's quite close to my heart, and I know it's not everybody's way of practicing, is I do think veganism is something that's really worth considering. I'm a slightly imperfect vegan. I travel so much. I end up... I'm vegetarian, I have a bottom line, and occasionally I go down to that bottom line, but I try to stay a fair bit above it, as it were, by really trying to be as vegan as possible, because that impacts less, as I understand it, on the planet's resources. Things like that, of withdrawing from that meat industry, withdrawing from all that cruelty, withdrawing from, well, consumerism of a certain type. But in terms perhaps of influence, well, that's an interesting one. Here in the US, I'm not quite sure what is your best way of doing that. And I think for different people, that'll evolve differently. So it might be, for some people, it might be about engaging with other groups who are also interested and involved in important issues and allowing our voice to be heard alongside those other voices. One of the things that occurred to me in this conference that I've just been at, there were, I don't know how many traditions of Buddhists were present there. There were about 200, about 180 participants from different communities. And one of the things that struck me was that there's something about coming together around issues that I think is really important. I'm not particularly interested in, although it's kind of interesting, I don't need to learn new practices, for example. You know, I'm not looking for new Buddhist teachings or practices. I think I've got everything that I need, as it were, in my own practice. But I think there are ways that we can come together and create bigger community where our differences are there and they're acknowledged, but our care for the world, for example, and our desire to speak out against injustice, to speak out against poverty, speak out against war. The more of us there are, then the bigger voice in a way we have. And so I think for individuals within Triratna to bond together with other Triratna people who care about the same issues is a great start. And when Bante talks about creating community, I don't think he stops at just that point. So I think we can also, as a community, those of us who are interested, can create big links with other communities, whether they're Buddhist communities or eco-communities, other communities who are also willing to engage in public dialogue. And I think just in a way, I think the answer to how do we have a larger voice is have it, do it, speak out, shout out, as it were. And I would say that it's quite important to do that alongside other voices that are important, that care about these things. And actually we can make changes, you know, we can alter and affect how society is. I really do believe that we can. So I think other ways that there are other people who do, will do that in other ways. So we have members of our community that work in medical services, work in law, where they maybe feel they're able to have an influence. I think it's quite important to be in relationship to influence makers, because some of us might have great ideas and we might have great values, but we might not be in positions of great influence. So unless we decide that we might want to go out and try and stand as president of the US, which I don't know how much you would be able to affect anyway doing that, but there might, you know, there are other ways that we can be engaged in the civic world. And I do think it's important that we do that. It troubles me sometimes when some of my brothers and sisters in the order feel that they don't want to engage with world issues, they don't want to engage in you know, the problems of the world. And while I might be sympathetic to that, actually, I don't think we've got that option anymore. If this is a talk which is kind of initially aimed at younger Buddhists, you know, you guys are going to have a bloody hard time. You're going to be in trouble, you know. My generation have sown the seeds for your disaster, and I am sorry for that. I apologise for that. I really do genuinely mean that. And, you know, not just my generation, it goes back further than that, but I think the baby boomer generation, you know, a great generation in many ways. We probably wouldn't have the Buddhist movements that we have in the West, the convert Buddhist movements, if it wasn't for a number of people from the baby boomer generation, the post-war generation. But, you know, hey, we've been a pretty irresponsible generation in ways as well. And you guys that this is aimed at, you under 35s, under 40, under 25s, maybe there's even somebody listening that's under 20, I have no idea. You know, you're going to have to face some of these problems. And so I think it's important that all of us are really taking that into account and doing the best we can as individuals, and also as a movement, really trying to influence where we can. I don't know, Rajapata, I'm assuming that you're still listening. I don't know whether you that answers anything, or whether you might even meant to make some suggestions yourself, which I could then share. And also whether there are any other questions or anybody else that would like to. I believe you can in fact do that by putting a question in the question box at the right hand side of your Google Hangout. And I also just thank, I imagine it's Chandradasa who's put up a whole series of things there that can be looked at and listened to later. Background to things that are that I've mentioned through the last hour or so. So anybody else out there get anything that they would like to add, or Chandradasa like to text me anything else that you'd like me to talk about? Okay, still there, that's good. I mean, one thing maybe I'll mention while I'm just waiting to see if anything else comes through the ether. I think, you know, I really am pleased that some Buddhist centres in the UK, which is where I'm based, are starting to become certificated as green centres. So there's an order member in Ipswich Centre in England called Amalakatu, and he, I believe his background is environmental, and he does environmental audits. So he'll go to, I believe in fact that that's happening here at Arialoka, in one of our centres in the East Coast in America. So Amalakatu has a way of auditing when the output and you know how the Buddhist centre is in green issues, and if it comes up to certain standards, then he issues a green certificate. And I'm really delighted that a number of our centres in the UK have now had those green certificates issued to them, and others are also working on that. So that's a really good initiative, and I'd love to see more of those initiatives. And okay, so somebody's just come up saying they've got a comment. So Cesar, you have a comment? That's a terrible question, Cesar. Is that you who's said, oh no, it's the Buddhist Centre Online who's just said, what do you say to people who despair in the face of it all? Well, the first thing I say is I can completely understand that. I completely understand that. I have felt that myself. And I'll mention Joanna Macy here because she's been quite a pioneer really in working on what she calls despair and empowerment work. And I first came across that in, probably in the 70s actually, or the 80s. And I did some work on my own, and then I did some work with her, and some of us in the order and in Triratna community have brought some of that into into the order and movement. So basically, which is a really great book, which is called Reawakening to Head, what her book's called. It'll come back to me. Anyway, this is Joanna Macy, and in that she goes through a series of work and workshops that she offers, where she starts off by we just acknowledge how we feel. Well, actually, the work starts with, she works through a spiral, and the first bit of that spiral is gratitude. So she starts by saying, let's see what we have gratitude for. Let's see what this world has given us, what is wonderful and beautiful and awesome about the world that we have. So in doing that, we really can open our hearts, and we start with that. And then she moves into work where we acknowledge our despair and our anger, because sometimes it's anger that's our response, it's grief sometimes it's despair, all of those things. And she's created exercises in which we can really allow ourselves to experience and share that despair. And I think one of the things about sharing it and really kind of coming into relationship with it is it allows it to move on. So I have actually led these workshops a lot over the years. I did for quite a few years with other members of the order. We've run workshops using some of that work and kind of bringing it more into line with our own understanding of Buddhism. So we've slightly worked with some of those exercises to make them, they're relevant anyway, but to make them relevant and also to give them a Buddhist ritual context. So it's the work that reconnects is what this work is called. And I think it's Joanna Macy's incredibly great contribution to this kind of issue that we're talking about. So I think to say to anybody who feels despair, I think probably the main and first thing to say is you're not on your own. I can feel it now, even just thinking about it. I can just feel how easy it is to fall into despair and to fall into a sense of that there is absolutely nothing that one can do. And of course, we feel that more and more with the bigness of the problems that we're trying to face. And so, for example, with the talk on climate change, if we really believe that we've passed the tipping point, what do we do to respond to that? How do we respond to that? I mean, I prefer to believe that we've not quite passed the tipping point, and I don't think that is just naive optimism. It might be, but we have to do something anyway. So let's believe that we've not passed the tipping point and really try and sort of work with that. So I think if I feel a sense of despair, then it's important for me to acknowledge that pain and turn towards it, not to deny it by pushing it away, because that is where so many problems come from, the denial. But to actually acknowledge the grief that I feel. And one of the things that comes out in some of these exercises that Joanna has given us, when we do them and when we really get in touch with that sense of very, very deep grief, that grief is only there because we love. And what comes through from that sense of grief is a real love for ourselves, for each other, for the planet. And so I think we need to find ways to really tap into that love. And when we deny the despair and the anger and the hatred and all the things that we feel inside ourselves in the face of these problems, when we deny them, we also deny our access to those feelings of love and care and desire to really work for the good of the world. So that's what I would say to anybody who's feeling despair. First of all, you're not on your own. Secondly, allow yourself to feel it, but come to it with a sense of gratitude as well for the wonders that we have. So I think we could do more with some of that work. And in fact, I was talking, this might be of interest to some of you in New Hampshire and around that kind of area, that I was talking to Amala from Aryaloka about coming next year and doing some of this work at Aryaloka. I have done in the past a couple of workshops here, but I'd like to offer some more of that work to really help us to kind of come together and to work together. So hopefully that kind of responds a little bit. So I'm just seeing somebody earlier said they had a comment, and it would seem that what the comment is that this is a great thing to do. So thank you for that. I'm not actually sure if everybody can see all the comments as they come up. So I'm kind of like dealing with them as if you can't, but yeah, and I'm answering them in that way. So thanks for putting up. So I see that the link to Joanna Macy's work that reconnects has now come up as well. So here's another question. With all the polarization of views in the world, how do we work with people whose views are extremely solid and impenetrable? Impenetrable. Oh my goodness, yes, well that's a very good question, and it's a very hard one. I mean, the kind of glib answer is also the true answer, and it's that you have to meet them with love. In a way, there is no other answer. There really is no other answer. And we cannot change those other people. We will not be able to make them change their views. So all we can do is try and come from metta in response to that. My friend Akupa wrote something called the Shambhala Warrior Mind Turning, which I read out on the open mic night at the Buddhist Teachers Conference, and I can't remember it to quote. I can't remember it exactly to quote it, but he is basically saying something like, yeah, just face hatred with love. I could maybe try and find it and read it to you because it is absolutely delightful. I'm getting a message saying to explain to people how to open the question and answer app so that they can see the notes, but I can't actually. I think what you have to do is go to the left-hand side of your screen, and you'll see there's a whole variety of icons down the left-hand side, and one of those icons is Q&A. So I think you have to click that, and that will open your box of Q&As. So, okay, I think some people might not be able to pose or see questions. Aid them in activating to the right. Okay, so I know that it's to the right, but what I'm trying to figure out is how you activate it. And I think what I've just said might be right, that you activate it from the left. Is that true, Mr. Buddhist Centre Online? Because otherwise I'm not quite sure how you do activate it. Yeah, it's on the left. It's down the left-hand side. I believe that you'll find the icons. So those of you who are looking in that haven't got the box, there's a box, a strip down the right-hand side, which shows the questions and answers as they're coming up. That means it's also showing the links that we've been given. So if you click that Q&A icon, it should give you access to everything that's there, which includes access to links for the things that I've been talking about. So the last thing was about the polarization of views and how we work with people who views are extremely solid. And as I was saying, I think the only thing you can do is to try and really face that with love. I mean, it's very hard sometimes in the face of like really, really fixed world views. But I think we just have to work on ourselves and just keep not reacting, which is not easy. I mean, there's a real art or talent or something that we can learn, I think, in terms of how to respond without reacting. Because I think often what happens is our response when faced with these kind of views is to get angry and push back against them. And that's our so it's a reaction rather than a response. When we don't want to do that, what we often do is kind of just pull back and think, there's nothing I can do here. So ways of trying to come into relationship and keep in relationship while not reacting, I think is quite hard to do. Anyway, we've been going now for about an hour and 20 minutes almost, which is quite a while. I'm hoping that those of you who are viewing have been able to see the links. I believe that this will be, when I stop, we'll be able to save this, and it therefore will be available for people to come to later. So I'm happy to think about rounding off now. I'd just like to say, you know, just to kind of finish that topic of polarization, is if we, this is part of the big problem, isn't it, is that we do polarize, whether we're polarizing in that very small level with somebody in our close circle that we don't agree with, or whether it's in the bigger sense of polarization. And it really is so much the problem that's happening in the world. It all comes down, it's going back to what I said about egos kind of, you know, banging off against each other, whether it's in the individual sense or the broader sense. And although it might sound like a very trite answer, I do really believe that, you know, as the Buddha said, hatred will never be overcome by hatred. Only love can overcome hatred. So as well as thinking of things that we can do, ways that we can act in the world, ways we can simplify our carbon footprint in the world, ways that we can act to alleviate the suffering that we see around us, we also need to come back into working on our own sense of metta and peace and love, so that that is what we offer to the world, so that we become part of the solution rather than continuing to be part of the problem. So I don't know if there are any other questions that anybody would like to type in, or whether everybody's ready just to round off and have lunch or whatever it is that you're about to do. Go to bed, get up, whatever it is that you're doing wherever you are. So I think, to round off, I'm basically just going to stop broadcasting. I think that's probably what I'm going to do. I'll just see if Chandradas is going to send me a text saying, yes, just stop broadcasting, at which point I will. Before I do that, I'd just like to thank the Buddhist Centre Online for hosting this. And, you know, it looks like there's been 9 or 10 viewers. I don't know what that means. It might be that some of those viewers are more than one person. And anyway, it's been moving for me to actually articulate some of the things that I believe in so deeply and that move me so deeply. And, you know, I've now had 35 years, more than that, of practice, and I still totally believe that what Buddhism can offer the world is a radical response to the world's problems. So thank you for the host, thank you for hosting, thank you for putting up all the links and everything, and I'm going to stop broadcasting, and I'm just going to dedicate any merits that might have been gained in the making and doing of this broadcast to the alleviation of the suffering in the world. And thank you.